Raelan and Agle, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It is wonderful to be here. I'm a big fan of everything that you do, and it's just really exciting to get to be a guest in your space. So thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And as I was saying to you earlier, I just wanted to start off by thanking you because, and I know this will come on behalf of many of my viewers and listeners as well, because the amount that your channel and the content that you put out has given just myself alone over the last years has truly been invaluable. It's definitely got me through some very, very difficult times. I know I'd go on a binge scrolling through through all of your recovery videos, and yeah, genuinely, it's been a lifesaver for many people, and I don't say that flippantly. I genuinely mean that. So yeah, I just wanted to start with that because I think it's very important for me to say that.
Oh, that's really nice to hear, and I appreciate you saying that. It's one of my absolute honors and passions in life to get to do this. So yeah, I'm just grateful to be able to have this space and be able to connect with so many people and help share so many people's really inspiring recovery stories because there's so many out there.
For sure.
So yeah, it's a
Yeah.
great opportunity to do it.
Yeah, and I think there's more and more of those coming out now, which is nice because I think beforehand it was very barren. I think the landscape a few years ago, you'd hear you'd maybe read one WordPress blog post once in a while about somebody who recovered from chronic fatigue syndrome, and they were maybe from halfway around the world. And now you start to see more and more people, whether it be on YouTube, Spotify. So that is really, really good to see. But before we get into the recovery stories, I would love to share with everyone your own recovery story and your experience with chronic fatigue syndrome. So I'd love if maybe you could take us back to maybe a little bit before you came down with this illness, and then if you could walk us through what happened and how you ended up in this position with chronic fatigue syndrome, and walk us through a little bit of your journey with that illness.
Yeah, I'm smiling a bit as you ask that because I'm thinking, uh, after having interviewed so many people, and I imagine you're seeing the same. I could almost try to, like, if there were a script to follow of what a story looked like, I think mine would be your pretty classic script. At the time, my journey felt so unique and confusing and lonely and just all of the things. And now after talking to so many people, it's a pretty common story. Of course, there's variations, but some of the overlaps definitely. I think anyone going through this will probably recognize a couple of things in their own journey from mine.
Mhm.
So prior to ME/CFS coming on, I was just living a regular life, except that perhaps I pushed things to the limits more than most people. I was an excessive exerciser. I worked 6 days a week, sometimes up to 3 hours a day. I was always working full time and either juggling a full time job and a part time job, or going to school full time and working part time, or some combination of the above. And I traveled a lot and was still sometimes like partying on the weekends and not treating my body well, and just really had no concept of self-care. And I was in a high anxiety state all over the time. No
Mhm.
matter how much I was doing, I felt like it wasn't enough. I felt like I wasn't good enough. I was stressed out at work and didn't feel like I was just always a bit nervous in that professional space, and pushing myself so hard with exercise, not because I wanted to be super healthy. It was more around, vanity and looking good in my clothes, and just that pressure that I felt as a woman, a human, that we have to look a certain way. So I was essentially just burning the candle at both ends, constantly in a state of stress and anxiety. And then I just got a really bad flu. I was coming off of a really long trip. I was really run down, and a really bad virus knocked me out for a solid 7 days. And then I just kind of didn't recover. It seemed like it was going away, but then it would come back and I didn't know what was going on. Went through the regular cycle of what people do, went to the doctor. And as was quite common then, this was 15 years ago, and still, unfortunately, common sometimes for people now. My doctor did all the tests, found nothing, and I was dismissed and sent home and told that there was nothing wrong with me, but I could barely get out of bed. I was calling in sick to work all of the time. I just couldn't function. I couldn't go to the gym. And I just didn't know what to do. And like most people, I just turned to Google and started trying to figure it out myself. And I eventually found an integrative medicine doctor who believed that I wasn't well and eventually diagnosed me with chronic fatigue syndrome. And began a journey of 10 years of trying everything under the sun that you can think of. I think if you could list it, I think I've just about tried it all. And just a really kind of roller coaster journey of sometimes being, on the more severe end of it, sometimes on the more mild end of it. But for a solid 10 years, I didn't have a single day where I just felt okay. It was always some level of struggle. It's just, what did that struggle look like? Until I eventually pieced together my own recovery puzzle and found my way past it. And for about 5 years now, I've been good and recovered, thankfully.
That's incredible to hear. Like, and such a long time as well. Like, I think often people get worried with regards to the amount of time that you've been ill and whether that will impact the recovery. And I think it's so inspiring to hear somebody who's been ill for a significant amount of time. But a couple of things I'd like to touch on there is, firstly, how did that look in terms of going to the doctor and trying to find some sort of answers? Because obviously you've hinted at that there, but even now with long COVID and chronic fatigue syndrome, so much more in the mainstream relative to how it was 4 years ago, 5 years ago, let alone 10, 15 years ago. And it's still incredibly frustratingly slow and difficult to get a diagnosis or even believed in some cases. So firstly, I'd love to know, what was that like back then, all of those years ago? And then secondly, you've talked about, for these 10 years, obviously this incessant symptoms every day. How did that present for you? Because some people, obviously, their symptoms are very much more neurological. Some people may be more physical. Somebody maybe have more sort of gastro symptoms. How did you present, and how did they kind of fluctuate over time?
Okay, so starting with the doctors, my GP who I went to, who I really liked and I trusted, and she'd moved to a new office that was across the city, but I stayed with her because I really liked her. And just to set the stage that I went into this, like, okay, I'm so glad I have this amazing doctor that I have this good relationship with. And back then, and even now, a lot of us have the mentality, like, something's wrong with me, the expert doctor is going to fix it. Like, I'm here, she's going to save me. Like, she's the one who's going to figure out what's going on, and she's going to fix this horrible, scary situation. And maybe a slight shift that's happening from 15 years ago to now is I hear more and more people actually are at least encountering doctors who are aware of ME or CFS. I don't think she even was. That didn't even come up in conversation. I kept coming back, and she just seemed to get frustrated with me because like, there was nothing she could do, but I couldn't go to work and I didn't know what to do. So I thought I need to take a short-term leave, disability leave or sick leave, extended sick leave, until I figure this out. And I needed paperwork to support that. So I went in, and she was just, I've talked about this a few times in different spaces, so apologies if someone's hearing this again, but it was one of those profound moments in my journey that just is seared into my brain, because the way she looked at me so dismissively and so like I was a little bit crazy. Like, how am I supposed to fill out paperwork when there's nothing wrong with you? And I was just devastated. I can't get out of bed. What do you mean nothing's wrong with me? And I left and never saw her again. So at that time, I wasn't finding virtually any help within the conventional medical system. The doctor that I ended up seeing, an integrative medicine doctor, so he was trained in conventional Western medicine, but also in, Ayurveda and a whole bunch of Eastern medicine as well. So he had a very different approach. So at the time, that was where I found my support, was just leaving behind conventional medicine and going into that world of alternative medicine. And even then, there were no answers.
Mm-hmm.
But at least having a doctor who believed me, and he was honest. He's like, I don't know what the answer is, but let's work on this together. And he very much empowered me to be an active person in this journey, which is a brand new way of thinking. But no, this is your job. I do stuff.
Mm-hmm. It's an agency, isn't it?
Yeah.
agency to want to do something and have that empowerment to go about it rather than just well, you just give me a pill or whatever. And it's, like you said, it's a very different way of thinking about medicine, though.
Yeah, and I actually play a role in this, and I have some power, and what my instincts are telling me matter, and when my opinion matters. Before it was just do as you're told, go away, take this medicine or whatever. So yeah, I mean, he didn't necessarily have a lot of answers for me, but for those first really tough couple of years, I think he's what kept me alive because it was a very depressing, very hopeless place that I was in, but just having this person that kept like, okay, let's try this. Like we always had a new idea and just like he'd recommend books to read and just he really got me on this path of learning about health and trying to figure out for myself
Mhm.
to get better. So that to your first question is from my experience, the difference over the last, decade or two, what
Mhm.
it looks like going to the medical system. And then you ask about symptoms. So my symptoms were fairly, I don't know, I'll say classic, if there's such a thing, but really bad post-exertional malaise from
Mhm.
both mental and physical activity. So the slightest things would lay me out. And I had brain fog, but it came and went in varying degrees. I had periods of time where it was so bad where I just kept a stack of paper beside me on the couch. And every single time I got up, I had to write down why I was getting up because every single time I'd forget once I stood up where I was going. Not like I might forget or every single time. Like if I was
Mhm.
getting up to get water, I carried this piece of paper saying, get water. And I just walked to the kitchen. But other times my brain fog was quite good and I could read books and, do different things. Yeah, really poor sleep, unrefreshing sleep. I developed all these crazy food intolerances.
Mhm.
Every bite of food I ate made me feel worse. I didn't even know what was safe to eat anymore. Um, yeah, just probably a whole bunch that I'm forgetting, but I mostly just felt laid out with like a really bad flu. And
Yeah.
that any kind of exertion made me feel worse. And it didn't matter how much I rested, I didn't feel any better.
So with your post-exertional malaise, then, because again, this is something that often I find that you get different kind of forms of it. Was it both the mental and the physical stuff then that seemed to lay you out? Because I know you talked about you had real difficulty with just like going for walks and things like that. Um, and then obviously you have these periods with the brain fog flaring up as well. Did you feel like in these periods your post-exertional malaise was more affected by one or the other, or was it kind of both equally
Um,
badly?
That's a good question. It was probably more the physical stuff. Very little, small amounts of physical activity really, really could lay me out, whereas I could do a bit more of the cognitive stuff. But I had to be still very careful, even if a family member or someone came to visit, just even short periods of social interaction, I would
Yeah.
feel laid out for quite a while. So it's a tough one for me to say. But if I had to pick, I'd probably say the physical post-exertional malaise was worse.
Yeah, it's so strange. I find it's so bizarre with the malaise because you obviously have this weird like flu-like symptoms from the physical stuff, but then also mental things will set people off. Like for me, the mental side is so much worse than the physical stuff, and then
Mm.
also kind of emotional triggers as well. That you think, why am I feeling so bad today? And you're like, oh, okay, so what? I had this emotional event yesterday, maybe something stressful at work, and I think the unpredictability of it is what makes it so difficult as well. I don't. How did you deal with that? I know obviously you had your husband at the time, but how did you deal with being essentially out of work and 10 years of this kind of unpredictable nature where you're just bouncing up and down in terms of your health and not really knowing what was going on? How did you deal with that?
I'm smiling again because I'm thinking, how long do you have? I mean, 10 years, it's a long time and it sort of broke down, give you the short version that won't put people to sleep and keep us here all day. It was sort of in phases. My first couple of years were really intense, and it's when my symptoms were the worst, where I was in bed most of the time. I almost never left the house. I couldn't, say 19 days out of 20, I couldn't walk to the end of my block to get the mail. I was not working, not doing anything. And think I was just on survival mode then. I don't even know how I got through it. The thing, a big thing that was helpful for me was that the brain fog lifted and had breaks. So reading was very, very big for me. And I'd go through periods of time where I was averaging about 4 books a week and mostly about medical stuff. So it was that, like, I'm actively working on it. I think it just gives you hope. And that was
Mhm.
during that same time I had that integrative medicine doctor, also like my ally. So those kind of kept me going. And after that couple of years of working with him and a couple of years of just being at home in this bubble focused on self-care,
Mhm.
I started to see some improvement. I don't know how to put a number on it, but it wasn't even 50% improved. But I was better. I have a few usable hours. I could like go out for coffee, meet a friend, and then I'd have to come home and lay down the rest of the day, but I could do some things. And I had a sort of, I don't know, early midlife crisis. I don't know what to call it, but I couldn't be in this bubble of just obsessive healing anymore
Mhm.
after 2 years of every thought I had and virtually every word I spoke being about how do I get myself out of this nightmare. And I felt like I tried everything under the sun. I'd read every book I could find, seen every specialist, tried every fast, every cleanse, every
Mhm.
supplement. I'd spent tens of thousands of dollars, and I really didn't think there's anything left to try. And I was miserable and hopeless and really, about to give up on life. Like I can't keep living this way. So I had a shift where I thought I need to just focus on trying to find a little bit of joy in
Mhm.
life. And I'd always wanted to do some significant travel. Um, it's crazy that I did this because I tried going back to work 2 days a week for 4 hours each time, and I couldn't do it. I would lay down on my desk. I was just, it would finish me off.
Mhm.
So I couldn't handle 8 hours a week of work, but yet somehow I decided I was going to travel. And I thought, like, if I have to crawl around, if I'm in bed all day when I get there, at least I'm in a new place. And I
Mhm.
had some money from the sale of I got divorced. Part of my, like, just things in my life just felt like they were unraveling. I got divorced. I moved back in with my dad and my childhood home, which, although I love him, that just kind of fed the depression of like my
Mhm.
life is going the wrong direction and there's nothing left. And so yeah, I went and I ended up moving to another country, and I went just on what was meant to be a long-term holiday, and I stayed. And it was a struggle, but I found I did get a little bit better there. And I think everything now that we understand about the role of stress and our fear and anxiety and the autonomic nervous system and all of that, just traveling and being somewhere new on its own wasn't enough to fix me, but I started doing a little bit better. So in that phase, I sort of existed because I had some joy and happiness in my life, but it was still every day was just like this obstacle course of how am I going to get through it? How am I going to have enough energy? Where am I going to get my
Mhm.
naps? And pushing too hard and crashing and never knowing what those limits are. So I'd say that was phase two. And then phase three was about 8 years into my journey where I just realized I couldn't keep living like that. Even though I had pockets of usable time and energy, my life was still so hard.
Mhm.
So hard. Everything was hard. And so I just went all in. And at that time, I just met my now husband. And I think having his support and just, that love and connection in my life made all the difference. And I was fortunate that he supported me financially as well at that time. So I was able to go back all in again and really focus on getting well. And that time I was able to do it.
That is such a yeah. That's well condensed. You condensed 10 years well into a few minutes there. I think it was from one of your podcasts, and I just wanted to pick up on this because I know you talked about there about this, going out to travel and being like, look, I need to find some degree of joy in my life. And I think it was on your podcast something that really, really resonated with me, which talked about so many people get kind of stuck somehow in this perpetual state of needing to find the optimal, perfect, 100% clean, sterile, stress-free environment in order to recover. And that will be the thing that enables you to recover, whether it be moving house, whether it be removing every external stressor in your life, every single bit of food, never doing anything stressful, etc. And I went about that approach for a little while, but it it's so limiting that you become so sensitive to any kind of external stresses. And I'm not saying obviously that you need to go off and do random you don't have to go and do the traveling thing or whatever, but like
Yeah.
it's this kind of knowledge that you don't necessarily, to recover, is not, it's not 100% necessary to completely rid your life of any kind of toxin or exposure or stress or anything like that. And I think that in many ways becomes more of a self-fulfilling prophecy when you do so like that. And I think that's quite a good testament to it with your experience there as well.
Yeah, I'd say not even close does it have to look anything like that.
Yeah.
Having gone through what I've gone through and all the people I've talked to since, I think it's more about just shifting a focus off of sickness and onto living, onto
Yeah.
finding little pockets of joy. Not a perfect, pristine life of joy without stress. Even when I went traveling, it was incredibly stressful. I'd never done that by myself. I was in the other side of the world, all by myself with a chronic illness. I knew nobody. I wasn't speaking the language. I couldn't, like, it's not like I just was on some, mountaintop with Buddhas and in
Hmm.
serene. Like it was not an easy thing. So I think it's just about living, finding little bits of joy, because humans are resilient and we're meant to deal with stress and we're meant to deal with some level of toxins and all of that. And I haven't talked to a single person who had to eliminate all of that and create
Yeah.
some perfect environment. And I think when you try and create that perfect environment, it just backfires and you end up creating the opposite of what you're aiming for, because it's
Yeah.
very stressful trying to achieve the impossible, which is
Hmm.
essentially what we're trying to do. So yeah, I
And
think that's a really
you
good point.
become more and more intolerant to the stress that does occur as well. So I think
Yeah.
you become less resilient, and it affects you more and more. And I found that myself as well. So I'd love to dive into, so obviously you went through these phases, and then you went through this period where, like you said, you had the support of your now husband, and you did notice some improvements that managed to get you up to this kind of, we say like the 100. I don't like the 100% thing, because I think it
Yeah.
sets this kind of false um idea of what it is to be just a normal, like, healthy person, because you always have these fluctuations. But from your experience, what were the key things that you did that you attribute your recovery to? Was it time? Was it certain things that you did? Was it the lack of stress? What were some things that really stand out now you look back with hindsight?
It's interesting. Yeah. Looking back with hindsight is the key part of that question. Because if you'd asked me 5 years ago, my answer would have been very different.
Okay.
It's still the same things. But I understand them differently. And I really believed in the body's ability to heal itself under the right conditions. So my approach
Mhm.
was just to support my body's own healing mechanisms. And at that time, I thought that there was a lot that was physically wrong with my body. I mean, clearly there must be. I thought been so sick for so long. So I was coming at it from all angles, like supporting my lymphatic system, completely changing my diet, working on my gut health and fermented foods, and all things that are really important. And they did help me. Like they helped me get rid of like UTIs and yeast infections, and I stopped getting colds and flus. My immune system just got so much better.
Mhm.
So when I look at it now, a lot of the things I did, I think were just generally helping my health. But the things that specifically that were addressing the NE-CFS aspect of things, I think were actually only a couple of the things that I did. And one of them, and people, please don't stop listening at the sound of this word, let me explain, but one of them was exercise, but not what you're
Mhm.
thinking. Because exercise always made me feel worse, even very small amounts. I was very scared of exercise. But I'd seen through my travels that sometimes I could do physical activity and movement and not only be okay, but actually start to slowly get better over time. Like, for example, I noticed times when I was in smaller areas or small towns or villages, I would just rent these just little, basic bikes, and I'd slowly pedal around, something that I would have thought would have been impossible for me to do. But I
Mhm.
was so happy enjoying it and I could do it. And then I started scuba diving, which again, I would have thought would have been impossible. And it was challenging and I had to take a lot of days off and rests and so forth. But slowly over time, I was getting better. My symptoms were decreasing and I felt like I was getting stronger. So I saw that activity had the ability to make me feel better. So I started this very gradual, slowly increasing exercise program. I've talked about it many times. I just started with 1 minute a day or 1 minute every second day. And it might just be like some arm circles, or it wasn't a gym or lifting weights. It was just
Yeah.
move for a minute a day. And then the next week, if I felt up to it, I upped it to 2 minutes. And then I did 2 minutes. And I found that every week, what I did would give me little symptom flares, but nothing significant. And then the next week, I could do 2 minutes with no symptom flares. Then I'd upped it to 3. And now 3 would give me little symptom flares, but then I'd feel okay. And then the next week I'd do 4. And that week, all of a sudden, 3 minutes was no problem. So I was seeing week after week after week, I could do more and more. And it wasn't that linear or that rigid. Some weeks I would not up it, or, I just kind of was flexible with the process, and just went with the flow. But a big piece for me was that. And I see it now more as working with my threat assessment systems in my body, kind of like when you're treating phobias, like a gradual re-exposure therapy to movement, just teaching my brain and my body that movement was okay. Because I wasn't doing anything that was actually building up any strength in my body. It was really gentle, just move a little bit every day. So at the time, I understood it more like an exercise program, but now I see it more as more like, brain retraining, and that whole piece that we're understanding is a big component for at least some people.
Yeah,
So,
becoming exposing gradually, isn't it? I think is that key thing, because it's like with a lot of things, whether it be like social anxiety or other sort of treatments where you have that kind of exposure response. And I think obviously I'm not comparing the two as conditions, but in terms of the treatment that goes about, it's that stretching yourself so you feel a degree of discomfort, but not to the point where you're completely overloading your brain and body and it just comes crashing down. Because like we've all been there through, and I'm a massive I'll be a hypocrite to talk about this, because I've done this so many times where I just say, right, I'm actually feeling all right, I'm just going to go smash it, and then I'll end up bedbound for a week, and that does no good to anybody. But like you said, when you have that kind of gentle stretching of the boundaries in a very gentle and compassionate way, like you said, it can help to teach your brain and your body that, okay, we're actually safe doing these kind of activities, because before it's not.
And an interesting thing, because again, we talk a lot about this now. Wow, I wish I'd had the information we have now then, because that would have really helped me speed up my recovery. But just on my own, for whatever reason, without hearing this from anybody else, I was able to come to the understanding that I couldn't freak out about symptoms anymore. I couldn't be scared of them. I didn't need to react to them. So as I slowly started doing more in life, and I would get these symptom flares, in the past, that would cause me to panic, like, oh my goodness, and get depressed, and I'm never going to get better, and look at this. And somehow I just put it together that I'm going to need to occasionally feel worse in order to get better, and that's okay. So these symptom flares would come on and be like, yeah, I was expecting this, and it was just no big deal. I mean, it's still annoying. It's not that I didn't notice them, but it was a completely different experience. So I think that piece also, even though I didn't understand its role at the time, was also a really important thing that helped me finally start getting past this.
It's really interesting, because I don't know if you've read the book The Way Out, where it's a book on on chronic back pain, and one of the key things around chronic back pain and the treatment process, it talks about the patient gently kind of paying attention to the pain that they're experiencing, the discomfort that they're experiencing, similar to the exposure therapy for things like OCD. You experience the discomfort, the horrible sensations, and in a kind of light, observant way where you're not reacting to it or not engaging in it. And it allows you to kind of watch it and sit with that and sense, and your brain, and essentially telling your brain, it's okay. We're not in danger. We're not alarmed here. And I think that, often there's this debate about like, what is underlying, what's causing, et cetera, et cetera. But I think from my point of view, like regardless of whatever the physiological stuff that is going along, if you can change how your brain relates to those sensations, that can only be a positive thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And in that book, I love that book, by the way, and they talk about how actually these approaches do work for symptoms that are experienced as a result of structural abnormalities in the body. So like our brains are really powerful. Our nervous system is, our threat assessment system, that it's all working together. Not saying that you should try and retrain your way out of a broken arm, but there are It's not
I'll
so
give it
black
a
and
go.
white that it works for this and it doesn't for that. Our brains are our control center for everything. So yeah, this is why I say, because in the end, when I got really serious about recovering again, it took me about a year and a half, 2 years. But that was without any of the information. If I just had even that one book, I think that would have sped things up by at least 50%. So yeah, it's amazing the understanding we have now of things.
For sure. So the exercise was something then that you gradually increased. You obviously talked about your diet that, I've seen you talk a lot about diet and saying like, and also the variety of different diets that you've seen from people who have recovered. And there, again, doesn't seem to be, I think it's very easy to become obsessed and fixated on one particular diet is the game changer. And I've tried endless ones. I've tried vegan, paleo, carnivore, antihistamine, like juicing, fasts, etc. And like every time I kind of come back to the conclusion that probably fairly close to like how nature presents the food, as in, i.e., a paleo diet, not too many sweets, not too many cakes,
Yeah.
and try and add some kind of intermittent fasting in there. Was that the similar sort of conclusion that you came to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did virtually all of those things too, and was
Yeah.
convinced the whole let food be thy medicine, mantra. Like it's the fuel, it's the building blocks of my body. There's no way this isn't a massive piece of my recovery puzzle. And of course, it's important in generally in life, but very few people I've talked to have been like, my diet changes were what saved me. Most people actually
Yeah.
just got more stressed. And the main benefit that I observe with myself and with a lot of the people that I talk to, just generally from diet anyways, is when we go keto or we go carnivore or we go vegan, mostly what we do is we cut out the garbage and we get to a more whole food way of eating. So just my throwing that in there, my own perspective, I think that's the main benefit we get from some of these efforts that we make. And when I recovered, again, talking about how I understood it then, because I wrote a book about my recovery called Finding Freedom. It's a really good book. The recovery strategies in there, take them with a grain of salt because I understand them differently now. But there's a whole section on diet and fasting, and I thought that was a really important piece of
Mm-hmm.
my recovery. And I no longer think that it was. And I recovered on a vegan diet, and I
Mm-hmm.
thought that was a really important piece of my recovery and what allowed me to get better. I no longer think it really had anything to do with it at all. So not saying pro or con vegan diet, but just I don't think the diet changes were what
Yeah.
addressed CFS
I
symptoms.
think people are like, it's the vegan, it's the carnivore, or
Yeah.
maybe it's the big bowl of pasta that isn't being eaten. Maybe that's more to it, or the Twinkies, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So diet wasn't a key thing. Exercise gradually increasing that was.
Yeah.
What were a couple of the other key things then you think on reflection now? It's very interesting you talk about this hindsight versus 4 or 5 years ago versus now. I think that's a really interesting development.
Yeah. One thing that has stayed the same that I still believe was very important was I put a really strong emphasis on sleep. Sleep at all costs was my motto because I had really bad sleep for years. And I knew that a lot of repair happened in our body while we were sleeping, repair that was virtually impossible to replicate under circumstance. But now I also realize even bigger, I think, was just the mental health piece. Because when you're chronically sleep deprived, everything in life is harder. You get more overwhelmed easily, more depressed, more anxious. It's just hard to have that resilience to keep picking yourself up and, plugging away at this. So I did everything I could to sleep well. I ended up sleeping in a separate bedroom by myself with blackout curtains and, earplugs and eye mask. And I was taking sleeping medication for a while. Like medication wasn't my go-to, but if I had to, so I still stand behind that one because I think prioritizing sleep went a really long way. And then also just a lot of the little stuff that we take for granted, things like getting some sunlight, spending a
Yeah.
little bit of time outdoors in nature, doing some things that I didn't totally see how important they were at the time, but just to help with my mental health and my stress, things like journaling or a little bit of meditation or talking to a counselor and just all of those sorts of things. So yeah, I guess the mental health and just the general body support through just healthy food, sunlight,
Mm-hmm.
exposure to nature, all the good stuff that no one when they're really sick really wants to hear about because that doesn't sound like that's what's going to deliver significant results. But think it is really all a bunch of those little things
For sure.
consistently over time that all make a difference.
So let's also talk about brain training as well, because I know that you had some experience with that. You've obviously spoken to a lot of people who have gone through that, um, gone through the recovery with that being a very key part, or at least a key component, and that becoming aware of symptoms when they come up, and then kind of disassociating from them. Also the somatic tracking, which we talked about, which is that kind of like watching of the symptoms and being more comfortable in those symptoms, which is very similar to techniques which are used in like I said, things like OCD and also with chronic pain. I know you talked about the sort of gradually ramping up the activity in a way was kind of stretching those boundaries and again teaching your brain to try and become more comfortable in those situations. But did you, looking back on reflection, engage in the meditation or the brain retraining type work, or was that something that for your recovery wasn't really necessary?
I see now that I was doing brain retraining the whole time. I just didn't have a name for it and I didn't understand what I was doing.
Okay.
So it was just I knew I had to go from being afraid of doing everything and everything in the world seemed like something that was dangerous and off limits for me to slowly start doing those things again and trusting that I would be okay. I wish I knew everything I knew then or now, certainly then, because I do believe it would have helped me speed that up a lot. Mm. Because now so many of the people that I talk to and all of just the research and the science and in the data is telling us that, that so much of this boils down to fear. And you talked about anxiety and, these were some of the key things that led us into this for many of us. I used to think it was, I pushed myself too hard and I was burning the candle at both ends. And then it just like the straw that broke the camel's back. But it wasn't the activity. Like it wasn't having two jobs that made me have any CFS. It was the anxiety and the mindset and the internal critical voice always telling me that things weren't okay. I wasn't okay, living in
Hmm.
fear. So yeah, I feel like I've rambled off point and lost the point of the question.
Yeah.
So let me
Mm.
bring it home with this. I didn't do any official brain training with my recovery. I'd never even heard the term. But looking back, what I just intuitively sort of put together is, I believe, was brain training at its core and eventually was the key thing that got me out of it.
Hmm. And I guess then from the sound of it, it wasn't like you were doing some kind of official program or official, I'm going to sit down and do X exercises or whatever, but it kind of
Yeah.
changing your relationship with your thoughts and changing your relationship with how you're reacting to activity as well. Because I mean, there's a really good book like The Body Keeps the Score and also Gabor Mate, and they talk about the implication of how that kind of like those emotional stressors and the way that your brain fires and reacts to not just external things but also reacts to yourself internally, how that does have a real profound impact on your physiology as well. And I often get into kind of debates about it, and I like there's obviously so much science around the whatever it be, whether it be like the autoantibodies or the neurological existing stuff that is going on, the physiological physical changes that are happening. But I always just come back to the point of, if we can change our relationship with how we deal with the sensations, the thoughts, and everything that arises, that can only be a good thing. That can only be a positive thing, like in that chronic back pain study.
Yeah.
And if being in less of a reactive state allows us to relax a little bit more and allows our body to kind of focus more on healing as opposed to fighting things, then surely that can only be a good thing. And I think that's where I think there's a little bit of this, sometimes a bit of heat in that debate, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, I think it boiled down to, for me, and I think for a lot of people, to three main things. One was getting rid of that fear as much as possible. So I was no longer daily in this state of panic over my condition. I was just at peace with where I was. And then also trusting the process. I had put together a plan for myself and I believed it was going to work. And also knowing that it's possible. We have so many recovery stories now, which is incredible. But not too long before I started at the end of my journey working on my full recovery, whatever we want to term it, because I agree with you that is a problematic term in itself, but that's a whole other discussion. I'd read a book that was written by Toby Morrison, who runs the CFS Health in Australia. And I don't think it's even in print anymore, but it was telling his recovery story. And he was the only person I'd heard about that had recovered. Just one. But I had that one person. I'm like, if that dude can do it, I can do it. So I think it's those pieces, trusting the process, getting rid of the fear, and just knowing that that it is possible and that you can do it. Probably oversimplifying a bit, but that mindset piece that we like to not really give a lot of credit to, I think is a really important driver in all of this.
I think the agency, isn't it? I think the the agency to be able to reframe and how changing relationship to those thoughts and fears and sensations can physiologically change the state in the brain. And that's why I really think people should read that book, The Way Out, because it doesn't just, it's not some wishy-washy bullshit about, think positive and then your symptoms will go away, but it demonstrates clear changes in the areas of the brain that are associated with pain and pain evoked activity. And they see massive drops and that can only be a positive thing. So I know you need to leave very shortly, but as one of a final question, because you've obviously spoken to, you're a book of knowledge when it comes to ME/CFS. You've spoken to endless amounts of people who have had the condition and recovered from the condition. I wondered if you could very quickly break down for people some of maybe the top 3 or the top 5 things that you seem to see across people who recover. Obviously, it's a very heterogeneous condition, and it will vary massively person to person. But from your experience, I know you did a video on this. What are some of those kind of common practices or lifestyle changes, whatever, that seem to help?
Yeah, and I'm in the process of working on because I haven't done a video on this topic I think I did one that was covering 75 recovery stories, and now I'm at about 175 recovery interviews that I've done. So it's interesting. At first I was thinking, is there anything different between then and now? And I think the most interesting thing to note in this is how the nature of those stories have changed over time. And I've only been doing these interviews for 4 or 5 years, which doesn't sound that long. You think, how much has changed? But it really has changed. At least the way the information is trickling down to us laymen, general public, is changing, and we're disseminating it much faster, through platforms like yours and mine. So when I first started interviewing people, it seemed like the recovery stories were all over the map, and I couldn't make any connections. Some person would say, I did a carnivore diet and then I was better. And someone might say, I quit my job and then I was better. Or I got out of a stressful relationship. Or I went to see a shaman in the jungle and did combo, like frog poisoning. And it's just, I'm like, wow, okay, this is, I hope I'm not just adding more confusion to the world out there, but I thought I'll just keep putting these stories out, and then it can just be like a buffet and people can listen and see what resonates, and maybe like, oh, something about their journey sounds like mine. Maybe this is something worth looking into. But then it very quickly shifted into a theme of recovery stories being sort of internal transformation that people couldn't really articulate well or explain why that was important. I realized I was really my anxiety, or I was driving myself too hard, or I was in a toxic relationship, or in a very stressful job, or I wasn't living the life I wanted to be living, and every day that misalignment. And I started feeling very uneasy about these interviews, because I thought, I have very sick people watching these interviews, right? Desperate, in a bad place. And I'm looking for information that could help me. And you're interviewing people that are saying like, oh, I needed to spend more time outside with the squirrels. I'm just, this is not the answer that very sick people are looking for. But interview after interview after interview was about addressing that anxiety and the fear and the stress, and shifting to joy, and about internal transformations that are hard to articulate. And then from there, the interviews started shifting again in that it was the same kind of stories, but people seemed to understand better what was happening, and they were able to make, generally speaking, faster results. I think rapid recovery is very much the exception, not the norm, but, not taking years to recover. But now people were talking about the role of their limbic system and their autonomic nervous system and their amygdala and their threat assessment systems and their fear, and doing somatic tracking and brain reprocessing therapy and brain retraining exercises, and how quickly those things started to turn around. So generally speaking, the biggest themes have been around mindset, internal transformation, addressing all of those things that I just mentioned, with some outliers that don't talk about any of that. And, it is maybe some combination of supplements. That's almost never the case, or, some specific red light therapy they were doing, or, hyperbolic, what's the oxygen therapy, or
Hyperbaric chamber, yeah.
hyperbaric, thank you. Yeah. So I'd say a very small percentage of the time, it's a whole bunch of different things like that, or a specific medication they started taking. But the vast majority of the time, it's been about that sort of internal transformation, addressing fear, addressing threats, addressing their mindset, and just kind of rewiring those things in their body through some process.
It's amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing, Raelan. I know you need to shoot, but thank you so much for your time. And again, thank you so much for all of the videos that you do. I look forward to seeing them continue past 175 to 275 and 375. So yeah, thank you so much for all of your time, and I'm sure everyone's thoroughly enjoyed it.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure, and right back at you. I know you're doing so many amazing things in so many great spaces, reaching a lot of people. So just how incredible that there's all of this out there for people now. So just, a lot of love to you for what you're doing. I know a lot of people are grateful for it. So yeah, thank you as well.
Appreciate it. Thank you.